listening to Adapt or Die. My name is Matt Gunn, and in this episode, we'll explore the nature of demand, its effect on the supply chain, and how machine learning and AI provide an outside-in view of customers' needs and the external forces driving the future of business, ultimately paving the way for forward-thinking decisions and an intentional approach to managing the enterprise. Joining me for this episode is Vikram Srinivasan. Vic looks after the demand products at LLamasoft and brings a wealth of hands-on experience to the conversation. So we're going to talk about something really universal here. Today, Vic, introduce yourself to us.
Hey guys, I'm Vikram Srinivasan. Call me Vic. I've been at LLamasoft close to 7.5 years now. Have a background in operations research. Have always loved innovating and bringing new products to market. And that's what I do for a living here.
Excellent. Vic, you've been around the space for a while then, and you've got some perspective on demand modeling, on forecasting, on some of the challenges that businesses are trying to get ahead of every day, and they're still pretty bad at. Can you give some perspective on just the history of what we talk about when we talk about demand?
Yes, absolutely. I think demand is probably one of the most easiest and difficult things that a company deals with. The easy thing is the more demand you have, the better you sell, the more profit you make, and everyone understands that part. The difficult part is to predict it. The difficult part is to understand what drives it. And the difficult part is to have a way that you can kind of go away from what the 90s used to do and kind of have it more applicable to what's going on right now with the day and age of data and AI and being able to put that in context.
We talk about supply chain all the time. It's really the demand chain that we're talking about. It all starts with that demand signal, whatever it may be. And so often, I guess, people are pulling the demand signals from something that happened months or years ago. Is that right?
Yes. So you're absolutely right. So it all starts with the customer demand. No demand, there's no real supply chain. You're not serving your right customers. So if that's the case, though, to your point, companies have been doing demand forecasting, demand modeling for a long time. And what we've seen in the market is they base that off of one variable, which is demand history. And that's not a bad start. It's a good starting point to kind of base yourself off what you did in the past and see where the trends are based on that growth. But there are about 10 to 15 more variables and factors that are going to be impacting your demand. And if you don't consider that, then the forecast you're basing that out of, it only solves for 1/10 of the problem. And hence some of the inaccuracies start creeping in, which has a lot of impact and inefficiencies in the longer term on the supply chain decisions you make. I'm talking about multi-million-dollar decisions that companies have to make.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit because, yes, the forecast is only as good as the outcome, right? And we all wake up every day and try to see what the weather is going to be, and sometimes that's even hard to get right. But when it comes to a supply chain where we're moving things globally, we're sourcing very far abroad, it gets on a ship that goes, over the ocean for weeks or months. There's a lot of time built into this process. What are some of the impacts when you get the forecast wrong? Just high level.
Yeah, exactly. And you hit some of those, which is that idea of a bullwhip effect in supply chain. So if you get your customer demand wrong, right, you're planning for that for, shipping materials months before. Like you said, if you have ocean and you're shipping from China, you're planning that 3 months before. And if you get a forecast wrong there, you've been shipping a lot more or a lot less than what you need to. And depending on the case, you either end up with too much inventory or you end up expediting with air freight, which is extremely expensive. And so that's just a simple example of inventory and transportation spend. Then you're talking about cash flow issues. You're talking about service issues, a lost sale issue. Customer service levels is it's a key. And if you get that wrong because you couldn't forecast right, then you're losing out on a customer potentially. And that can have huge impacts in your supply chain. Yeah, and the other part of this is in a very highly competitive environment, we're talking about market share. If you don't predict where the market's going, if you don't understand where you need to be making investments, which product lines you need to grow more than others, then you end up in not a sustainable business, which can be a problem too.
Are there industries that the reason that they forecast the way they do is just a symptom of success and sustained growth? Like I'm thinking of like a CPG company. You know exactly how many cookies you're going to make because that's how many cookies sold in a store last year, and the year before it was 10% less, so you know that there's going to be some growth. Do we just get really comfortable in that pattern of depending on sustained growth of sales, increased volume to predict where we're going?
That's a great question. I think there's two parts to it. One is, yes, because sometimes they believe that they've done this year over year, It becomes very comfortable. So they have this process in place, and they just follow that process, and it's pretty repeatable. But in most industries, especially in today's day and age, it's highly variable. Change is the only constant. So in those examples, leveraging the age-old techniques that are more deterministic, that expect things to be pretty much consistent, is going to be a struggle. And that's where I think companies are starting to see that, and it's coming from even understanding your point of sale data a little better can have a better impact into your supply chain forecasts. So absolutely.
Okay, talk about point of sale, volume sold. What are the biggest factors that drive forecast right now? What are the things that people rely on? What should they be thinking about versus that picture?
Yeah, and I think there are some factors that are common across most industries, and sometimes it gets industry specific. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Most macroeconomic indicators like GDP, consumer price index, consumer confidence can be very universal and applicable to most industries. You take a manufacturing example, you take consumer, packaged goods, retail, they're pretty much similar. And then there's this nuance within each industry. So manufacturing can depend on more of those macroeconomic indicators specific to manufacturing sectors. I've seen examples where companies use GDP mining as an example to help inform their long-term forecast as well, or household to GDP ratios. In retail, it's all about point of sale, promotions, price, consumer price index. In food and bev, temperature can be a highly important variable, along with other aspects. So yes, there's just a lot of nuances within each industry, but there's also some common areas to start with that drives most of our supply chain decisions we make.
Let's kind of go into how that manifests itself across the demand plan. You know what your causals are, or what your data points are that you're trying to track. You understand kind of where your sales are, where you'd like them to be. But it seems like there's a lot of data within all of that. I mean, point of sale isn't a clean piece of data. I mean, there's sales happening all across the board. There's sales happening at different times with different promotions through different channels. How do you decipher the important aspects of that data when you're starting to build a plan for your future production runs?
That's a great question, and that's why I'm really happy that we have a lot of AI-based capabilities in the market that customers are starting to leverage, and leveraging that external data effectively, right? So when you think about all this data, there's your historical data, which has a lot of patterns just in itself, seasonality, trends, lags, and so on. Then you bring in external data like point of sale and so on. And these can be in different formats, in different levels of granularity. And how do you take all this and understand and prioritize each of these? By the way, the prioritization might vary by SKU that you're looking at, or by region, or by SKU region. So there's just a lot of variation. I think AI does a phenomenal job in really breaking down through some feature engineering and understanding how do you weigh out these different external factors, and then how do you prioritize them so that in the end you are giving the right weights and not either coming up with a model that's over predicting or overfitting, but giving you the right weight so that when you make the decision, it's truly well informed with what I call an outside in approach, where you start with your customer, you start with the data that they are driving, and then use that to inform your forecast better.
Yeah, it seems that everything kind of begins with the customer and ends with the customer within this whole cycle. But the AI itself might not know that. So where do people come in to kind of work with these algorithms, work with this intense math to piece it all together? It's not like it's run by machines right now, is it?
Exactly. I think the human aspect of this and the interpretability of the AI is a key aspect, right? So the AI, for example, there's a very well-known concept between correlation and causation, right? So you have some variables that are highly correlated to your demand. They may not have any impact or make any sense to why they drive your demand. But when you bring in the right human intelligence and the right domain expertise, where these guys have been in this industry for more than 20 years, they can tell you exactly, once you serve up the right data, they can look at it and tell you which ones make sense and which ones don't. And to your point, Matt, that for me is the most important aspect to it. AI with the right amount of human intelligence, balanced together, would do the magic.
Okay, so we kind of mapped out a few things. And then this is really just taking a look at the baseline, where we've been, what the challenges are, where it's going. I have a sense that some of that AI and machine learning element is where we're going in the future. But what are the potential results, or what are the areas of improvement that you've started to see between, say, a company that's started that journey and one that's moved a little bit farther along the line?
Yeah, and I've seen a variety of use cases where AI has had significant impact and moved the needle forward. So we're talking about, sometimes in companies, depending on the size of the company, a 1% accuracy improvement can translate to, I'm talking multi-million dollars in cost savings, in better service percentages that you'd have for your customers, and so on and so forth. And we have seen companies leverage AI and external data to go to about 15 to 20% improvement. The key there is it's not just improving the demand forecast. They are very certain about what factors drive that forecast, so they're able to be more proactive and monitor those factors. So as those change, they also understand their future is going to change. And I think this is the fundamental thing I've seen, looking at what's happened with the older techniques to what we have here in 2019 is around forecasting. We've heard the phrase that says every forecast is wrong. What I believe is every forecast isn't wrong. I think the process we've used might be incorrect. And what I mean by that is if you have the right assumptions and you know what the assumptions are that drive that forecast, then the forecast is right for those assumptions. The key is the assumption set is going to change. The market is going to change. So if you get ahead of that, then your forecasting would also be more proactively managed better. And so we're talking about significant improvements in the precision of supply chain decisions for the mid and long term as well.
Okay, and that is a funny thing with forecast is that in supply chain it's pretty distinct. You get the forecast wrong, there's like a dollar amount associated with it, whether it's write-offs or stock-outs or whatever, the lost sale. In so many other places, no one's really grading a forecast. No one necessarily has incentive to improve it. And then so maybe that's why we have such a stigma around this concept that, forecasts are never right.
Yeah, exactly.
You talked about more than just a short-term forecast, but mid and long-term. I guess define what the difference is between those areas of forecasting, the different degrees of challenge, and how they affect your decisions in the supply chain.
That's a great point. And typically when you look at short-term forecasting, it's done to either drive an MRP, drive replenishment plans, and it's very important, critical for a business. But those are more near-term, and the impact of those are not as high as when you're looking at how's my brand doing for the next 3 to 5 years. Because if you get that wrong, the implications of that can be detrimental to your business. If I've seen, VPs of supply chain, CSEOs, having to make these multi-million-dollar investments in their supply chain, a simple investment like a CapEx investment, or being more agile in the supply chain, going more fresh, combating the Amazon effect, all these different things. There are a lot of investments you need to make in your supply chain to ensure you're ahead of the market and staying ahead of the competition. And so to do that, we're not talking about the next 6 months. We're talking about the changes that happen across the next 1, 3, 5 years. We got to be ahead of it. And in order to do that, that's when the mid to long-term capabilities of forecasting comes in, and it cannot be done with an inside-out approach, looking at your own history. Because everything I told you had nothing to do with your own performance. It was everything outside of your company about the market and the competition. So outside-in forecasting coupled with the right amount of applied artificial intelligence and machine learning, I believe can really change the game to how you make those long-term decisions with more strategic precision and certainty.
So in a way, everyone's kind of running their own race. But if your benchmark is your past performance, you really can't understand how to improve.
That's probably the best way of putting it, Matt.
Try to limit my words because they usually come out the wrong way. All right, excellent. We've covered a lot of ground here, but I guess the last question for me on this topic is around where to begin. It seems to me that there's a lot of different levels of maturity or acceptance of having a problem even before you can get started. It doesn't seem to me that you can just flip a switch and that you get results right away. What does it take to get really going?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to understand where the current gaps are in your process and to understand the importance of outside-in capabilities. And once you've understood that, the technology has come to a point where it's about less than 2 weeks from start to finish, from data to getting an accurate forecast and understanding each of the key drivers. The beauty of forecasting and demand modeling is you can measure it. In 2 weeks after that process, you can actually tell if you would be good or not, and you can actually quantify the improvements and see the exact implication to your supply chain. So I think the time to adopt, in my opinion, is more on the inertia of the process you've been used to, And as soon as you open yourself out to understanding, where the market's at and the importance of an outside-in approach to forecasting, I think the rest of it is pretty quick, honestly.
Excellent. I think that leaves us at a good stopping place with a lot of topics that we can dive much deeper into in future episodes. So, Vic, thank you for joining this, our first of hopefully many podcasts here. We look forward to more in the future.
Thanks, Matt. My pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Vic, and thank you to our audience for tuning in to this episode of Adapt or Die. My name is Matt Gunn, and to learn more about the podcast, please visit LLamasoft.com/podcast, or be sure to subscribe at iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast network.